The fire in the study had already eaten through 6 pages before Alistair Rothmore let himself breathe. His hand was shaking. He watched the wax seal blacken and curl, watched his own name written in a hand he knew better than his own turn to smoke, and still he did not stop. He told himself this was mercy. He told himself that a letter unread could not break a heart the way a letter read and answered with silence would. He was wrong, but he would not learn that for many years, and by then it would nearly cost him everything. 3 months earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Evelina Ashworth had written her first letter to him on a rainy afternoon in April, not because she wanted to, but because her aunt insisted that a proper introduction between 2 respectable families should begin with words on paper before words spoken aloud. Evelina had rolled her eyes at the instruction, certain that whatever Duke Rothmore wrote back would be stiff, dull, and full of empty courtesies. She was wrong too. His first reply arrived 4 days later, and it was nothing like she expected. He wrote about the strange comfort of rain against tall windows, about a dog he had rescued as a boy that still slept at the foot of his bed though it was old and half blind now, about how tired he was of people who spoke to him only because of his title, and never because they wanted to know the man underneath it. He signed it simply, Alistair. No titles, no formality, just his name, as if he were handing her something private. Evelina read it twice before she allowed herself to smile. What began as a formality became, within weeks, something neither of them had a name for yet. Her letters were quick and clever, full of observations that made him laugh out loud in an empty room, something he could not remember doing in years. His letters, though slower to open up, revealed a man who felt everything deeply, but had been trained since childhood to show none of it. Bit by bit, page by page, he stopped hiding. She wrote to him about the garden she was growing behind her family's home, how she had ruined 3 seasons of roses before finally understanding what the soil needed. He wrote back that he understood the feeling exactly, that he had spent his whole life trying to grow into a role that never quite fit, no matter how carefully he tended it. There is a particular kind of intimacy that grows only through paper and ink, when 2 people cannot see each other's faces and must instead listen only to words. Evelina began to feel, with each letter, that she understood Alistair more completely than anyone who had known him for years in person, and Alistair began to feel something he had never allowed himself before. Something dangerously close to hope. But hope, in his world, was a luxury reserved for men without duties, and Alistair Rothmore had duties stacked upon duties, inherited the moment his father died and left him a dukedom heavier than any crown. His father, Duke Henry Rothmore, had been a practical man, and practical men do not leave gentle instructions behind. In his final will, alongside land, titles, and debts that needed careful handling, there was a clause that would come to define the next several years of Alistair's life. The Rothmore estate, weakened by poor investments in his father's final years, needed strengthening through marriage into a family of significant means. It was not a request. It was written as a condition, tied to inheritance, tied to the survival of tenants and staff, who depended on the estate for their livelihood. Alistair had known about this clause for a year already. He had simply chosen, for the first time in his letters to Evelina, to forget it existed. It was his cousin, Edmund Halloway, who reminded him one evening over brandy that forgetting a legal obligation does not make it disappear. You cannot marry a woman with clever letters and empty pockets, Edmund said, not unkindly, but with the blunt honesty of someone who had watched Alistair carry the weight of the dukedom since he was barely 20 years old. You know this. You have always known this. Alistair said nothing. He turned his glass slowly in his hand and thought of Evelina's last letter, still folded in his coat pocket, where she had written about watching the sunrise from her bedroom window and wishing he were there to see it with her. He did not sleep that night. The following week, his family's solicitor arrived with papers that made the situation impossible to ignore any longer. A marriage had been proposed, quietly and through proper channels, between Alistair and Lady Margaret Fenwick, daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the county. The match would settle the estate's debts within a year. It would secure the futures of everyone who depended on Rothmore land. It would also, Alistair understood with a cold and sinking clarity, end whatever had begun to grow between himself and Evelina Ashworth. He did not answer her next letter for 11 days. When he finally did, his words were shorter than usual, careful in a way they had never been before. Evelina noticed immediately. She wrote back asking if something was wrong, if she had said something to offend him, if perhaps he was simply tired from the demands of his position. Her letter was warm and patient, the letter of someone who trusted the person she was writing to. Alistair read it 3 times. Then he placed it in the drawer of his desk instead of answering it at all. That drawer, over the following weeks, began to fill. He told himself each time that he would answer soon, that he simply needed to find the right words to explain what was happening without breaking something fragile and precious. But the right words never came, because there were no right words. There was only a choice between honesty that would hurt her immediately and silence that would hurt her slowly. Alistair, coward in this one particular way despite his courage in nearly everything else, chose silence. Evelina's letters continued to arrive, growing gently more worried with each one. Though never desperate, never demanding. She was too proud for that, and too kind. She simply kept writing, hoping that whatever had gone quiet in him would find its voice again. It was on a gray evening in late June, 3 weeks after his engagement to Margaret Fenwick had been formally announced in the county papers, that Alistair opened his desk drawer and found 17 unanswered letters staring back at him. He did not know, until that exact moment, what he intended to do. But he lit the fire anyway, and he began to feed her words into it, one page at a time. He told himself this was kindness. If she believed he had simply stopped writing, stopped caring, she would grieve quickly and move on with her life, free to find someone who could give her everything he no longer could. If she knew the truth, that he still thought of her every single day, that her handwriting alone could steady his breathing after the worst meetings with his solicitors, she would wait for him. She would hope, and hope, for a woman engaged to no one while the man she loved married someone else, was its own quiet cruelty. So he burned the letters, and he told no one, and he believed, with the terrible confidence of a young man who has never yet been proven wrong about something this important, that he was doing the right thing. He did not know, as the last page turned to ash that evening, that Evelina had just begun writing him a letter of her own, one that would take her 3 days to finish, one that would be the last letter she ever sent him. He would not read it for a very long time, and by the time he did, the fire that had once seemed like mercy would look, in hindsight, like the greatest mistake of his entire life. Outside his study window, the rain had started again, the same rain that had brought her first letter to him months before. Alistair watched it fall against the glass and told himself, one more time, that this was for the best. He almost believed it. Almost. The engagement announcement reached Evelina's family home 3 days after it appeared in the county papers, carried not by a letter from Alistair himself, but by her aunt, who read it aloud at breakfast without understanding what it would do to her niece sitting across the table. Evelina set down her teacup very carefully, as if the smallest sudden movement might shatter something inside her chest that had already begun to crack. She excused herself from the table with a steadiness that surprised even her, walked calmly up the stairs to her room, and only then, with the door closed and locked behind her, allowed herself to sit on the edge of her bed and simply breathe through the shock. She did not cry, not yet. She kept thinking there must be some explanation, some detail the papers had gotten wrong, some reason Alistair had not written to tell her himself. Surely a man who wrote to her about rescued dogs and ruined rose gardens would not let her learn of his engagement from a newspaper. Surely there was more to understand. She would spend the following weeks trying to find that understanding, never once suspecting the truth burning quietly in a fireplace many miles away. Her closest friend, Charlotte Wayland, arrived the following afternoon, summoned by a short note that simply read, "Come quickly, something has happened." Charlotte had known Evelina since childhood, long enough to recognize the particular quiet in her friend's voice that meant something serious rather than something small. "He is engaged," Evelina said, before Charlotte had even removed her gloves. "To Lady Margaret Fenwick. It was in the papers." Charlotte sat down slowly. She had read every one of Evelina's letters aloud with her over the past months, had watched her friend fall gently and completely into something rare, and she understood immediately what this news meant, even before Evelina said another word. "Did he write to tell you himself?" Charlotte asked. Evelina shook her head. "His last letter to me came 11 days before the announcement. It said nothing of this. It said very little of anything, if I am honest. I thought perhaps he was simply busy with estate matters." "Write to him," Charlotte said gently. "Ask him plainly. You deserve that much at least." Evelina did write to him, that very evening, choosing her words with more care than she had ever used before. She did not accuse him of anything. She simply asked, honestly and without anger, whether the engagement was true, and if so, what it meant for the friendship that had grown between them across so many letters. She sealed it with trembling hands and sent it the next morning, certain that whatever his answer, she would rather know the truth than continue guessing in silence. She did not know that her letter would arrive at Rothmore House on the very same evening Alistair had decided, once and for all, to stop opening anything she sent him. The letter sat unread on his desk for 2 days before it joined the others in the drawer that had become, without his ever quite admitting it to himself, a small grave for everything he could not bear to face. Lady Margaret Fenwick was not a cruel woman, and this fact alone made Alistair's guilt heavier rather than lighter. Had she been unkind, had she treated him with coldness or contempt, he might have found it easier to accept the marriage that had been arranged for both of them without either party being properly consulted. Instead, Margaret was polite, composed, and entirely indifferent to him in the particular way that people are indifferent toward arrangements they never wanted, but have long since stopped fighting. Their first meeting after the engagement was announced took place in the drawing room of her family's townhouse, with both sets of parents present, discussing wedding dates and dowry arrangements as though Alistair and Margaret were simply furniture being placed in a room already fully decorated. Margaret sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap and said very little, though once, when their eyes met across the room, Alistair saw in her expression something he recognized immediately, because he felt the exact same thing himself. Resignation. "You needn't pretend to be pleased," Margaret told him quietly, when the parents had stepped out to discuss financial details in another room. "I know this is not what either of us chose." Alistair, surprised by her directness, found himself answering honestly for the first time since he had stopped writing to Evelina. "No," he admitted. "It is not." "Then let us at least be truthful with one another," Margaret said. "I do not expect love from this marriage, Your Grace. I expect civility, and perhaps, in time, something resembling friendship. I think that is the most either of us can hope for." He nodded, grateful for her honesty, even as it confirmed everything he already feared about the years ahead of him. There would be no letters like Evelina's waiting for him in this marriage. There would be no laughter over rescued dogs or ruined roses. There would be duty, carried out correctly, and nothing more. That night, back at Rothmore House, Alistair opened his desk drawer again. Evelina's letters had multiplied since the engagement announcement, no longer weekly but arriving every few days, each one more careful than the last, each one asking gently whether something was wrong, whether she had done something to upset him, whether he might simply write back even a few words to ease her worry. He read none of them. He told himself, with the particular logic of a man determined to believe his own excuses, that reading even one would undo whatever fragile resolve he had built. If he read her words, he would want to answer them. If he answered them, he would want to see her. And if he saw her, knowing what he now knew about the marriage he could not escape, he would only be offering her false hope dressed up as kindness. So instead, he began a habit that would define the following months. Each letter that arrived from Evelina Ashworth went straight into the fire, unopened, unread, the wax seal still intact when the flames took it. He did not allow himself to see her handwriting. He did not allow himself to imagine what news or worry or gentle hope might be written inside. He simply watched the paper curl and blacken and told himself, each time, that this was the last one. She would stop writing soon. She would understand, eventually, that his silence meant she should let him go. She did not stop writing soon. Evelina Ashworth was not a woman who gave up easily, and for many weeks she continued sending letters, each one a little more vulnerable than the last, until finally, in a letter he would never read, she asked him directly whether he had ever cared for her at all, or whether the months of correspondence between them had simply been, for him, a pleasant distraction from a life he would return to without a second thought. That letter burned just like the others. Charlotte Wayland, watching her friend grow quieter and more withdrawn with each passing week, finally confronted her one afternoon in the garden, the same garden where Evelina had once written to Alistair about ruined roses. "You must stop this," Charlotte said. "You are writing to a man who does not answer. There is dignity in silence too, Evelina. There is a point at which continuing to write becomes its own kind of harm." Evelina, kneeling among the roses she had finally learned to grow properly, did not look up right away. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you are right. I simply cannot understand what changed. We spoke of everything, Charlotte. Everything. And then, nothing. As though I imagined the whole of it." "You did not imagine it," Charlotte said firmly. "I read those letters beside you. Remember, whatever happened, it was not imagination. But perhaps it does not matter what happened. Perhaps all that matters now is what you do next." Evelina considered this for a long moment, turning a rose stem carefully between her fingers, avoiding the thorns out of habit rather than thought. "I will write one more letter," she said finally. "Not to ask him anything, not to accuse him of anything. Simply to say what I feel, once, completely. Whatever happens after, I will know I did not leave it unsaid, and then I will stop." Charlotte studied her friend's face and saw, beneath the calm resolve, a heartbreak that had not yet fully arrived, still gathering itself somewhere behind Evelina's steady eyes, waiting for the moment when the full weight of it would finally land. "And if he never reads it?" Charlotte asked gently. "Then at least I will have written it honestly. Evelina said. That has to be enough. She did not begin that final letter immediately. It would take her nearly 3 weeks to find the words, weeks during which the wedding preparations for Alistair and Margaret moved steadily forward in the county papers, each announcement a small, public confirmation of everything Evelina had feared. A date was set for the ceremony. Guest lists were finalized. Alistair's name appeared beside Margaret's in print with the same casual regularity that it had once appeared, privately, in letters meant only for Evelina. Alistair read those same announcements with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest, as though he were watching another man's life being arranged around him, while he stood somewhere just outside it, unable to step in and change the course of anything. He had chosen this. He reminded himself of that fact daily. He had chosen duty over desire, the estate over his own heart, and there was no one to blame for the emptiness that followed except himself. He continued burning her letters, though they arrived less frequently now, each gap between them a small mercy he did not deserve and could not bring himself to appreciate. He told himself the silence meant she was healing, moving forward, finding a life that did not include him. He told himself this so many times that he almost believed it. He did not know that somewhere across the county, Evelina Ashworth had finally sat down at her writing desk, dipped her pen, and begun the letter that would haunt him for years to come, long after the wedding, long after the wax seal had cooled, long after he finally understood what he had spent so many months refusing to see. What Alistair did not know was that Charlotte Wayland was not a woman content to watch her closest friend suffer in silence, without at least attempting to understand why. 2 weeks before Evelina began writing her final letter, Charlotte traveled alone to Rothmore House, uninvited and unannounced, determined to look Alistair Rothmore in the eye, and ask him plainly what had happened between him and the woman she loved like a sister. She was kept waiting in the entrance hall for nearly 20 minutes before a servant finally led her through to the study, the same room where so many letters had already turned to ash. Alistair rose from behind his desk when she entered, visibly startled by the visit, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Wayland," he said finally, "this is an unexpected visit." "I imagine it is," Charlotte replied, her voice steady, despite the nervousness she felt standing in the home of a duke without any proper invitation. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Your Grace. I have come to ask you directly why you have stopped writing to Evelina Ashworth." Alistair's expression tightened, and for a brief moment, Charlotte thought she saw something like guilt cross his face before he composed himself into the careful neutrality expected of a man in his position. "My circumstances have changed," he said. "I am to be married. I imagine you have read the announcement." "I have," Charlotte said, "but that does not explain why you could not simply tell her that yourself. She has spent months wondering what she did wrong, Your Grace, months believing she imagined an entire friendship that clearly meant something to both of you, based on every letter I read beside her. A single honest letter from you would have spared her that." Alistair looked away, toward the fireplace where the ashes of Evelina's most recent letters still sat cold in the grate, though Charlotte could not have known what those ashes had once been. "Sometimes silence is kinder than the truth," he said quietly. "That is a convenient thing for you to believe," Charlotte said, and there was an edge to her voice now that surprised even her. "It allows you to avoid the discomfort of an honest conversation, while still telling yourself you acted with good intentions. But I have watched my friend grow quieter every single week, Your Grace. I have watched her stop laughing the way she used to. Silence has not been kind to her. It has simply been easier for you." The words landed harder than Charlotte expected them to, and she watched Alistair's jaw tighten, watched him grip the edge of his desk as though bracing against something. For a moment, she almost believed he might tell her the truth, might explain whatever complicated tangle of duty and fear had led him here. But whatever nearly surfaced in him retreated just as quickly, buried again beneath the composed mask of a duke who had spent his entire life learning to hide what he felt. "I appreciate your concern for your friend," he said finally, his voice formal again, distant. "But my engagement to Lady Fenwick is a matter of estate necessity that does not concern outside parties, however well-intentioned." Charlotte stood very still, studying him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the disappointment in it remained clear. "You are a coward, Your Grace," she said simply. "Not because you chose duty. Many good men choose duty. But because you chose it silently, and let someone who cared for you believe she was not worth even the courtesy of an honest goodbye." She left Rothmore House that afternoon without waiting for a reply, and Alistair remained standing in his study long after her carriage had disappeared down the drive, her words echoing louder in his mind than he would ever admit to anyone, including himself. He almost wrote to Evelina that very evening. He sat at his desk for nearly an hour with a fresh sheet of paper before him, pen in hand, trying to find words that could explain everything, without breaking her heart further. But every sentence he began felt inadequate, either too cold or too revealing, and eventually he set the pen down, folded the blank paper, and placed it in the drawer alongside all the others he had never sent. It was the closest he came, in all those months, to telling her the truth, and it was not close enough. The wedding between Alistair Rothmore and Margaret Fenwick took place on a bright October morning, 6 months after Evelina had first written to him about rain against tall windows. The ceremony was elegant and correctly performed in every detail, attended by everyone of importance in the county, and utterly hollow beneath its polished surface. Alistair stood at the altar and recited vows he meant in the sense that he intended to honor them, though not in the sense that his heart was anywhere present in the words. Evelina did not attend. She had not been invited, and even if she had, she could not have brought herself to watch it happen. Instead, she spent that morning in her garden, tending roses that had finally, after so many ruined seasons, begun to bloom properly, and trying very hard not to think about what was happening several miles away. It was that same afternoon, hours after the wedding vows had been spoken, that she finally sat down and began writing the letter she had promised Charlotte and herself she would write. It took her 3 days to finish, not because the words were difficult to find, but because she wanted each one to be exactly right, a letter that would say everything completely, and then allow her, finally, to let the whole matter rest. She did not know as she wrote it that the man it was addressed to would not read a single word of it for years to come. The letter began simply, though it took Evelina nearly an hour to write even the first line. She sat at her writing desk with the window open, the scent of roses drifting in from the garden below, and finally set her pen to paper with words she had rehearsed silently for weeks. "Dear Alistair," she wrote, and then stopped, because writing his given name still felt like something private, something she was no longer certain she had any right to. She continued anyway. She wrote about the first letter he had sent her, the one about the rescued dog and the rain against tall windows, and how she had read it so many times that the creases in the paper had softened from handling. She wrote about how she had never expected to feel understood so completely by someone she had never properly courted in the traditional sense, someone whose entire friendship with her existed almost entirely on paper, and yet had felt more real to her than any conversation she had ever had in a crowded drawing room. She did not accuse him of cruelty. She considered, more than once, writing something sharp, something that might make him feel even a fraction of what she had felt during the long silent weeks after his letters stopped arriving. But each time she tried, the words felt false, unworthy of what they had once shared, and she abandoned them in favor of honesty instead. "I do not know what changed," she wrote. "I do not know if I said something that frightened you away, or if circumstances simply made continuing impossible, and you found no way to explain it that did not feel unkind. I have turned over every possibility in my mind more times than I can count. But I find, now that your wedding has taken place, that I no longer wish to spend my days wondering. I wish only to say, plainly and completely, that knowing you, even only through letters, was one of the finest things that has happened to me. Whatever comes next for both of us, I hope you find in your marriage the same warmth you once offered me in your words. I will not write to you again after this, but I wanted you to know, at least once, exactly what you meant to me." She signed it simply, Evelina, the same way he had once signed his letters to her, no titles, no formality, just her name, offered honestly one final time. When the letter was finished, she read it through twice, folded it carefully, and sealed it with wax, though she found herself unable, in that moment, to address it directly to Rothmore House. Something in her hesitated, some instinct she could not fully name, and instead she carried the sealed letter to Charlotte's home the following morning, still unaddressed on the outside, waiting only for her final decision. "I have finished it," she told Charlotte, holding the letter out with both hands as though it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper folded twice. "But I find I cannot bring myself to send it directly. If he did not answer my other letters, I do not know that I can bear watching this one go unanswered too, and knowing for certain rather than simply wondering." Charlotte took the letter gently and turned it over in her hands. "Then do not send it directly," she said. "Give it to me instead. I will keep it safe. If there ever comes a day when you feel ready to send it, or when circumstances change in some way neither of us can predict now, I will make certain it reaches him. Until then, it will sit exactly where you leave it, untouched, waiting." Evelina considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me that if I never ask for it again, you will still find a way to see that he receives it eventually, even if it takes years, even if I have long since stopped caring how it is received. I want him to know, someday, even if that someday is far in the future." Charlotte studied her friend's face, searching for any sign that this decision was born of despair rather than clarity, but found instead a strange, quiet peace in Evelina's expression, the look of someone who had finally set down a weight she had carried too long. "I promise," Charlotte said, and she meant it completely, though neither of them could have imagined, on that ordinary morning in the garden, exactly how many years would pass before that promise came due. The months that followed were quiet ones for Evelina, though quiet did not mean easy. She watched, from a careful distance, as news of the Rothmore marriage settled into the ordinary rhythm of county life, mentioned occasionally in conversation, and then gradually less and less as newer gossip took its place. She herself received 2 proposals of marriage during that time, both from respectable men of good standing, and she considered each one seriously, weighing practicality against the quiet ache that still lived somewhere beneath her composed exterior whenever she thought of rain against tall windows. She declined both proposals, not out of any lingering hope that Alistair might somehow return to her, for she had genuinely released that hope the day she handed her final letter to Charlotte, but simply because neither man made her feel the way his letters once had, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that she would rather remain unmarried than settle for something lesser simply because it was convenient. Her family did not entirely understand this decision. Her father, in particular, grew increasingly concerned as the years passed and Evelina remained unwed, watching her decline suitor after suitor with the same gentle but immovable politeness. "You cannot spend your whole life waiting for something that has already passed you by," he told her once, not unkindly, during a quiet conversation in his study. "I am not waiting for anything, father," Evelina replied, and she believed it when she said it. "I simply have not yet met anyone I wish to spend my life beside. I would rather wait for that, however long it takes, than marry simply to satisfy an expectation." Her father did not fully understand, but he loved her enough to let the matter rest, and Evelina continued her quiet life, tending her garden, reading widely, and slowly, gradually, building a version of contentment that did not depend on the presence of any particular man in her life. What she could not have anticipated was how her health would begin, almost imperceptibly at first, to change over the following years. It began with small things easily explained away. Tiredness that lingered longer than it should after ordinary activity. A cough in winter that seemed to take longer than usual to fully clear. Evelina, never one to complain, dismissed these signs for a long time, attributing them to the ordinary wear of years passing, and it was not until Charlotte, visiting one autumn afternoon, noticed how pale her friend had become, that anyone raised serious concern. "You must see a physician properly," Charlotte insisted, watching Evelina struggle to catch her breath after a short walk through the very garden she had once tended with such vigor. "This is not simply tiredness, Evelina. Something is wrong." Evelina, reluctant as ever to make a fuss over herself, eventually agreed, and the physician's diagnosis, when it finally came, was serious enough that even Evelina's careful composure faltered for the first time in years. "A weakness in the lungs," the physician explained, "one that would likely worsen gradually over time, though with proper care and rest, there was no reason to expect anything sudden or immediate." Evelina absorbed this news with the same quiet steadiness she had carried through every difficult moment of her life, though that night, alone in her room, she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long while, to cry. Charlotte, informed of the diagnosis the following day, sat with her friend for hours, offering the kind of comfort that comes not from solving a problem but simply from refusing to let someone face it alone. It was during that conversation, quietly, almost as an afterthought, that Evelina mentioned the letter again, still sealed, still sitting wherever Charlotte had kept it safe for so many years. "Do you still have it?" Evelina asked. "I do," Charlotte said, "exactly as you gave it to me. Do you wish me to send it now?" Evelina considered this for a long moment, staring out the window at the roses she could no longer tend as vigorously as she once had. "No," she said finally, "not yet. I do not wish him to receive it out of pity, or because he has learned I am unwell. If it is ever sent, I want it sent, because the timing is right, not because circumstances have forced it. Keep it a little longer, Charlotte. I trust your judgment more than my own on this." Charlotte agreed, though privately, watching her friend's increasingly frail frame settled against the pillows, she began to wonder how much longer that timing could reasonably be allowed to wait. Neither of them knew in that quiet autumn conversation that circumstances were already beginning to shift many miles away, inside a marriage that had never found the warmth Margaret Fenwick had once hoped, however faintly, it might eventually grow into. There was in fact one moment during those years when Evelina and Alistair came close enough to speak, though neither of them ever learned how close it truly was, until much later, and by then the moment had long since passed beyond recovering. It happened at a charity gathering held in the grand assembly rooms of the county town, an event neither of them had particularly wished to attend but had each felt obligated to appear at for reasons of family standing. Evelina arrived with her father, still strong enough in those earlier years to manage such evenings without much difficulty, dressed simply but elegantly, her presence drawing quiet admiration from across the crowded room, even though she herself remained largely unaware of it. Alistair arrived later, with Margaret at his side, both of them performing the practiced civility that had come to define their marriage in public settings, smiling at the correct moments, exchanging the correct pleasantries with the correct people. From across the room, through the shifting crowd of silk and candlelight, Alistair happened to glance toward the far wall and saw, for just a moment, a woman whose posture and the particular way she tilted her head while listening to someone speak struck him with a familiarity so sharp it stole the breath from his chest. It was Evelina. He was certain of it before he had even fully processed the thought, some part of him recognizing her before conscious reasoning caught up. He did not move toward her. He could not have explained, even to himself, exactly why, except that the shock of seeing her after so many years left him rooted in place, his heart suddenly loud in his own ears, while the rest of the room continued its polite, oblivious chatter around him. Margaret, noticing his sudden stillness, followed his gaze across the room, though she said nothing, and whatever she may have suspected in that moment, she kept carefully to herself. Evelina, for her part, felt the weight of being watched before she fully understood its source. She turned, almost by instinct, and her eyes found his across the crowded room, and for a moment that felt to both of them far longer than it actually was. Neither looked away. She had imagined, more than once over the years, what it might feel like to see him again. She had expected anger, perhaps, or a fresh wave of old heartbreak, or nothing at all, a cold indifference born of time and distance. What she felt instead, standing across that room with the candlelight flickering between them, was something quieter and more complicated than any of those, a sadness that had nothing sharp left in it, only a soft and settled grief for something that had once seemed so full of promise. Alistair took one step forward, an instinct rather than a decision, but before he could take a second, Margaret's hand settled lightly on his arm, drawing his attention back with a question about one of the evening's hosts, a perfectly ordinary question that nonetheless anchored him firmly back into the role he was expected to play. By the time he looked toward the far wall again, Evelina had turned away, drawn into conversation with an old family friend, and the moment, whatever it might have become, had quietly closed itself. Evelina left the gathering earlier than planned that evening, claiming tiredness to her father, who did not question it, unaware that his daughter's early departure had nothing to do with fatigue, and everything to do with the effort it took to remain composed after seeing, across a crowded room, the one person whose silence had shaped so much of the years since. In the carriage home, she allowed herself to think, briefly and honestly, about what might have happened had circumstances been different. If his father had left no clause about marriage and inheritance, if she had been born to greater wealth, sparing him the impossible choice between duty and desire, if he had simply written to her honestly, whatever the truth had been, rather than allowing silence to answer for him. She did not dwell on these thoughts for long, recognizing them for what they were, a kind of gentle indulgence rather than anything productive, but she allowed herself the moment nonetheless, watching the dark countryside pass by the carriage window. Alistair, meanwhile, spent the ride home in near total silence, offering only brief, distracted responses to Margaret's occasional comments about the evening. Margaret, watching him carefully in the low carriage light, finally spoke what she had been considering since the moment she saw his gaze fixed so intently across the assembly room. "You knew her," Margaret said. It was not quite a question. Alistair hesitated before answering, uncertain how much honesty the moment could bear. "Yes," he said finally. "Before our marriage, we corresponded for a time." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing this without visible surprise, as though some part of her had already suspected as much for years, some instinct she had never quite allowed herself to examine too closely. "Did you love her?" she asked, her voice steady, curious rather than accusing. The question hung in the small space of the carriage for a long moment before Alistair answered. "I do not know that I allowed myself to fully understand what I felt," he said quietly. "I ended it before it could become something I would have to choose between and duty. I am not certain that was wisdom. I have wondered, more than once since, if it was simply cowardice wearing wisdom's clothing." Margaret said nothing further on the matter that evening, though something shifted quietly between them after that carriage ride, an honesty that had been missing from their marriage since its beginning. It did not create love between them, not in the way either might once have hoped for from a marriage, but it created something else. A genuine friendship built finally on truth, rather than polite performance. And in the years that followed, that friendship would prove far sturdier than either of them expected on that quiet evening. Neither Alistair nor Evelina ever spoke of that night to anyone else, though both carried it privately for years afterward, a brief and painful reminder that whatever had once existed between them had not fully faded, only gone quiet, waiting somewhere beneath the ordinary business of their separate lives, for a moment that would eventually, inevitably, call it back to the surface. That moment was still years away, but it was coming, closer with each season that passed, and neither of them, standing in their separate lives on that ordinary autumn evening, had any way of knowing how little time truly remained before the truth would finally demand to be heard. 4 years passed after that evening in the assembly rooms, years that settled into a rhythm neither Alistair nor Evelina could have predicted when they were younger, and still believed, however briefly, that their lives might unfold differently. Alistair's marriage to Margaret had grown, in that time, into something neither love nor emptiness, but a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, and the honesty that had first surfaced during that quiet carriage ride home. They managed the Rothmore estate together, with increasing skill, worked well as partners in the countless small decisions that running a large household required, and had, by most outward measures, built a successful marriage. But Alistair still woke some mornings with a hollow feeling in his chest that he could never quite name, and Margaret, though she never spoke of it directly, seemed to understand exactly what that feeling was, and never once made him feel ashamed of carrying it. It was Margaret, in fact, who first brought him the news that would upend the careful stability of those quiet years. She had heard it from a cousin who moved in the same social circles as the Ashworth family, mentioned almost in passing during an ordinary afternoon visit, the kind of casual gossip exchanged over tea without any particular weight attached to it by the person sharing it. Lady Evelina Ashworth, the cousin had said, had been unwell for some time, a weakness of the lungs that the physicians had been managing as best they could, though her condition had reportedly worsened significantly over the past several months. Margaret relayed this news to Alistair that evening with careful gentleness, watching his face closely as she spoke, having learned over the years to read the particular stillness that came over him whenever something touched the part of himself he kept most carefully guarded. Alistair said very little in response, thanking her quietly for telling him, and excusing himself shortly after to his study, the same room where, years before, he had burned letter after letter into a fireplace that had long since stopped holding any of her words. He sat there for a long time that evening, staring at the cold hearth, feeling something he had successfully avoided feeling for years, finally break through the careful walls he had built around it. He did not sleep well that night, and over the following days, the news settled into him like a slow, cold weight that would not lift no matter how he tried to occupy his mind with the ordinary demands of the estate. He found himself thinking constantly of her letters, the ones he had never answered, the questions she had asked, that he had let burn unread rather than face honestly. He thought of the assembly room, of the moment their eyes had met across the crowded space, of how close he had come to crossing that room, before Margaret's hand on his arm had pulled him back into the life he had chosen instead. He wondered, with a growing and uncomfortable urgency, whether she had ever understood why he had gone silent, whether she believed, all these years, that he had simply stopped caring, that whatever had grown between them in those months of letters had meant nothing to him beyond a passing distraction. The thought of her carrying that belief, especially now, with her health declining in ways that suggested time might be shorter than either of them had ever imagined, became unbearable to him in a way he had not expected. It was Margaret, watching him grow increasingly withdrawn over the following weeks, who finally suggested, with a generosity that surprised even herself, that perhaps he should seek out the truth directly, rather than continuing to carry the uncertainty alone. "You have never told me the full story of what happened between you," she said one evening, finding him once again in his study, staring at nothing in particular. "But I have watched you carry something unresolved for as long as I have known you, Alistair. If there is a chance to set it right, however that might look, I think you owe it to yourself, and perhaps to her, to try." "We are married, Margaret," Alistair said quietly, though there was no real objection in his voice, only the weight of a man trying to understand what honesty required of him now. "We are," Margaret agreed, "and I am not suggesting anything that would dishonor that. I am simply suggesting that some truths need to be spoken plainly, before it becomes too late to speak them at all. I would rather you find peace with this, whatever form that peace takes, than watch you carry it silently for the rest of our lives together." Her words settled something in him, a permission he had not realized he needed, and the following morning, Alistair made the decision that would finally set the last part of this story into motion. He would seek out Charlotte Wayland, the one person who might know the full truth of what had happened on Evelina's side during those silent months, and he would finally ask the questions he had been too afraid to face for years. Charlotte received his letter requesting a meeting with visible surprise, having heard nothing from or about Alistair Rothmore in the years since Evelina's health had begun its slow decline. She agreed to see him nonetheless, curious and cautious in equal measure, uncertain what could possibly bring a married duke to her door after so long a silence. Alistair arrived at her home on a grey afternoon, much like the one on which Evelina had first written to him so many years before, and the resemblance was not lost on him as he waited to be received. When Charlotte finally joined him in her sitting room, her expression was guarded, watchful, the same directness he remembered from her visit to his study years earlier, still evident in the way she studied him now. "I understand you have heard news of Evelina's health," Charlotte said, before he could offer any pleasantries. "I imagine that is why you have come." "It is," Alistair admitted. "Charlotte, I need to understand what happened. I need to know if she believes I simply stopped caring, or if there is any chance she understood, even partially, that circumstances forced my silence, rather than any change in my feelings." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal, before finally deciding that the time for careful protection of her friend's privacy had perhaps, given everything that was happening, finally come to an end. "She never understood," Charlotte said quietly. "For years, she believed exactly what your silence suggested, that whatever had grown between you simply mattered less to you than it did to her. It very nearly broke her, Your Grace, though she carried it with more grace than most people could have managed." Alistair felt the words land like a physical blow, confirming the very fear that had haunted him for years. "Did she ever write again, after the letters stopped?" he asked, though some instinct told him he already suspected the answer. Charlotte hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alistair felt something shift in the room, some truth about to surface that he had not anticipated. "She wrote one final letter," Charlotte said slowly. "The day of your wedding, in fact, though she did not finish it until several days later. She gave it to me to keep safe, with instructions that I should send it to you only when the timing felt right, though she never fully explained what that timing might look like. I have kept it, sealed, exactly as she gave it to me, for 4 years now." Alistair stood very still, the weight of this revelation settling over him slowly, painfully, as he understood at once both what it meant and how much time had already been lost. "Where is it?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "Charlotte, I need to read it, please." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, weighing her promise to Evelina against the clear urgency now visible in his face, and finally, with a small, resolved nod, she rose from her chair. "I will bring it to you," she said, "but you must understand, Your Grace, that reading it now, after everything, may not undo the years already lost. I only hope, for both your sakes, that it is not too late, for whatever understanding it might still offer." She left the room, and Alistair remained standing exactly where he was, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread he had not felt in years, waiting for words that had been sealed away, unread, for far too long. Charlotte returned some minutes later, carrying a small wooden box that had clearly been kept carefully all these years, its surface polished smooth from handling despite having remained closed for so long. She set it on the table between them and lifted the lid, revealing a single sealed letter resting inside, the wax seal still perfectly intact, exactly as Evelina had left it 4 years before. Alistair reached for it with a hand that was not quite steady, but before his fingers could close around the paper, a servant appeared at the sitting room door, breathless and clearly having hurried through the house to deliver an urgent message. "Forgive the interruption," the servant said, addressing Charlotte directly, "but a message has arrived from the Ashworth household. They ask that you come at once. Lady Evelina has taken a sudden turn, and the physician fears the matter is now quite serious." The room went very still. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth, and Alistair felt the floor seem to shift beneath him, the letter suddenly heavy in his grasp, its unread words now carrying an urgency he had not fully anticipated even moments before. "I must go to her," Charlotte said, already rising, her composure fracturing slightly around the edges, despite her best efforts to hold it together. "Your Grace, I am sorry, but I cannot remain to see you read this properly. Not now, not with Evelina." "Take me with you," Alistair said, the words leaving him before he had fully decided to speak them, though the moment he said them, he knew with complete certainty that he meant every word. "Charlotte, please, whatever propriety demands, whatever anyone might say of it, I cannot simply remain here reading a letter while she may be—" He could not finish the sentence, the possibility too enormous to speak aloud. Charlotte studied him for only a brief moment before nodding, understanding perhaps better than anyone the particular urgency now driving him, an urgency that mirrored her own. "There is no time to argue propriety," she said. "Come then, my carriage is already being prepared. We can discuss whatever needs discussing on the road, but we must go now." They left within minutes, the letter still unopened, tucked carefully into the inside pocket of Alistair's coat, close against his chest, as the carriage pulled away from Charlotte's home and began the long journey toward the Ashworth estate. The countryside blurred past the windows in the fading afternoon light, and neither of them spoke for a long while, both lost in their own private fears about what they might find when they arrived. "How long has she been unwell?" Alistair finally asked, breaking the silence somewhere along the darkening road. "Several years, in truth," Charlotte said quietly. "A weakness in the lungs, the physicians called it, though it worsened gradually enough that for a long time we believed she might manage it well into old age, with proper care. It is only these past months that things have changed more quickly than anyone anticipated. She never wished for you to know, Your Grace, not out of any lingering anger, but because she did not want your concern to feel like pity rather than genuine feeling." Alistair absorbed this in silence, the weight of years he had spent unaware pressing down on him with a force that felt almost physical. "Why did she never send the letter, all these years?" he asked finally. "If she wished me to know how she felt, why wait so long?" Charlotte considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe, in part, she wished to protect herself as much as you," she said. Sending it and receiving silence again might have been more than she could bear a second time. And I think, too, some part of her hoped that if it were ever received, it would be received because circumstances had genuinely changed, not simply because enough time had passed that the wound had scarred over. She wanted honesty in the timing, not convenience. The carriage rattled on through the darkening countryside, each mile bringing them closer to a moment neither of them could fully predict the shape of, and Alistair found himself gripping the letter in his coat pocket, as though it might somehow anchor him against the fear building steadily in his chest. He thought of every unanswered letter he had burned, every question of hers that had gone unread, every month of silence he had allowed to stretch into years, and he understood now, with a clarity that arrived far too late to change anything that had already happened, exactly how much that silence had cost them both. "I was a coward," he said quietly, more to himself than to Charlotte, though she heard him clearly in the small enclosed space of the carriage. "You told me that yourself, years ago, in my study. I did not want to hear it then. I understand now how right you were." Charlotte did not offer easy comfort, understanding that false reassurance would serve no purpose in this moment. "Whatever you were then," she said instead. "The question now is what you choose to be tonight, and in whatever time remains. That is the only part of this you still have any power to change." Alistair nodded slowly, staring out at the dark countryside rushing past, the lights of the Ashworth estate finally beginning to flicker into view somewhere ahead in the distance, and he understood, with a certainty that steadied something in his chest despite the fear still gripping him, exactly what he needed to do the moment they arrived. He would read her letter, and whatever it said, whatever truth or forgiveness or heartbreak it contained, he would carry it with him into that house and finally, after all these years of silence, tell her everything he should have said long before the fire ever took a single one of her words. The carriage came to a stop in front of the Ashworth estate just as the last light was fading from the sky, and Alistair stepped down before it had fully halted, his heart pounding with a fear he had not felt since he was a boy standing beside his father's deathbed years before. Charlotte followed close behind, already moving quickly toward the entrance, where a servant stood waiting with a lantern, her face grim in the flickering light. "The physician is with her now," the servant said, leading them quickly through the entrance hall and up a wide staircase Alistair had never before walked, though he had imagined this house countless times over the years from Evelina's descriptions of it in her letters. "Her father is with her as well. I am not certain, Your Grace, whether she will be able to receive visitors tonight." "I understand," Alistair said, though something in his voice made clear he did not intend to be turned away easily, not after everything it had taken to arrive at this moment. They reached a closed door at the end of a long hallway, and Charlotte, without hesitation, pushed it open and stepped inside, with Alistair following just behind her. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp beside the bed, and Evelina's father sat in a chair near the window, his face drawn with worry, rising quickly when he saw who had entered. "Charlotte," he said, relief evident in his voice, before his gaze shifted to the man standing beside her, and his expression hardened with confusion, and something closer to suspicion. "Your Grace, I did not expect, forgive me, but this is hardly the moment for a social call." "I did not come for a social call," Alistair said quietly, his eyes moving past Evelina's father to the bed where she lay, pale against the white linens, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes closed, though not, he realized with a small surge of relief, in the deep unconsciousness he had feared during the long carriage ride. I came because I have waited far too long already, and I could not bear to wait a single moment more. Evelina's father studied him for a long moment, some understanding passing quietly across his features, though whether it was full comprehension of everything that had happened between them years before, or simply the recognition of genuine urgency in a man's voice, Alistair could not be certain. Finally, the older man nodded slowly and stepped back from the bedside. She has been asking for air, he said quietly. And for quiet. The physician believes the next several hours will tell us a great deal. I will leave you a few moments, Your Grace, though I ask that you not tire her. He left the room with Charlotte following to speak quietly with the physician waiting just outside the door, and for the first time in over 4 years, Alistair found himself alone in a room with Evelina Ashworth, the only sound the soft, uneven rhythm of her breathing and the quiet crackle of the lamp beside her bed. He moved slowly to the chair beside the bed and sat down, his hand trembling as he reached into his coat and withdrew the letter. Still sealed, still carrying 4 years of unspoken truth within its folded pages. He broke the seal carefully, the wax cracking softly in the quiet room, and unfolded the paper with hands that had not shaken like this in years. He read her words slowly, deliberately, allowing each sentence to settle fully before moving to the next, understanding somehow that this letter deserved nothing less than his complete attention after everything it had taken to finally reach him. He read about the first letter he had sent her, the rescued dog, the rain against tall windows, and felt his chest tighten with the memory of a version of himself who had still believed, however briefly, that happiness might be possible for him. He read her words about feeling understood more completely through paper and ink than she had ever felt understood by anyone in person, and he thought of every letter he had burned unread, wondering how many similar confessions he had destroyed without ever knowing. He reached the final lines, the ones where she had written that she would not write to him again, that she wished him warmth in his marriage, that she simply wanted him to know, once and completely, what he had meant to her, and he found that he could not read the words through clearly, his vision blurring with tears he had not allowed himself in years. Alistair. Her voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the quiet room like a sudden bell, and he looked up immediately to find her eyes open, watching him, watching the letter still trembling in his hands, understanding immediately what he was holding, and what it meant that he was finally, after all these years, holding it. You read it, she said softly, her voice weak but steady. After all this time. Evelina, he said, her name catching in his throat, years of unspoken words suddenly crowding forward all at once, uncertain which to release first. I am so sorry. I never received your letters, not after a certain point. I burned them, Evelina, every single one, unread, because I convinced myself it was mercy, that silence would hurt you less than honesty. I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it, and I have carried that wrongness for 4 years without any way to make it right, until tonight. Evelina's expression shifted slowly from confusion to a kind of quiet, aching understanding. The years of believing herself forgotten finally reconciling with a truth far more complicated and far sadder than simple indifference. You burned them, she repeated softly, as though testing the words, trying to fully absorb what they meant. All this time, I believed you simply stopped caring. I built an entire understanding of those months around that belief, Alistair. I do not know how to feel, learning now that it was never true. I do not expect you to forgive me, Alistair said quickly, the words tumbling out now that the dam had finally broken. I do not know that I deserve forgiveness, not after everything my silence cost you, cost us both. But I could not let another day pass without you knowing the truth. I loved you, Evelina. I have loved you since your very first letter, and I chose duty over honesty, and I have regretted that choice every single day since, especially these past weeks, learning what you have been carrying alone. Evelina was quiet for a long moment, her breathing still shallow but her eyes clear and steady on his face, searching for something in his expression that seemed, finally, to settle whatever uncertainty remained in her. I am glad you finally read it, she said softly, even now. Even after everything. I meant every word I wrote, Alistair, and I find I still mean it now, knowing the truth of what happened. I do not know how much time remains for me, but I am glad, truly glad, that it did not pass without you knowing how I felt, and now, without me knowing that you felt something too, all along. Alistair reached for her hand, careful and gentle, and she did not pull away, her fingers curling weakly around his with a warmth that steadied something in his chest that had felt broken for 4 long years. You will have more time, he said, though his voice caught on the words, uncertain whether he was offering comfort or simply refusing to accept any other possibility. The physicians will find a way. I will make certain of it, whatever it requires, however far we must send for help. I am not prepared to lose you now, not after everything it took to finally arrive at this moment. You cannot control everything, Alistair, Evelina said gently, though there was no bitterness in the words, only a quiet, hard-earned honesty. Some things happen regardless of how much we wish them otherwise, but I do not intend to give up easily either, not now that I finally understand the truth. They remained together in that quiet room for a long while, speaking softly of everything the years of silence had kept between them, and though the physician eventually returned to check on his patient, insisting on rest, Alistair did not leave the house that night, nor the following morning, remaining close by as the physicians worked carefully to stabilize Evelina's condition through the following days. Margaret, informed by a message Alistair sent that same night, responded not with anger or betrayal, but with a quiet grace that surprised even those who knew her well, understanding perhaps better than anyone the particular shape of a truth too long delayed. She did not travel to the Ashworth estate herself, believing correctly that her presence would complicate a moment that needed simplicity above all else, but she wrote back words of genuine concern for Evelina's recovery. And something in that response, quiet and generous, would come to matter a great deal in the months that followed. The following week was the most uncertain of Evelina's illness, her condition fluctuating in ways that kept everyone close to her in a state of constant, careful vigilance. Alistair remained nearby throughout, not always at her bedside, respecting the boundaries her father and the physicians set carefully around her rest, but never far, always ready the moment she was strong enough to see him again. On the 7th day, her fever finally broke, and the physician, cautiously but genuinely hopeful for the first time since the crisis began, declared that while her underlying condition remained serious and would require careful management for the rest of her life, the immediate danger had passed. She would live, though how fully and for how long, no one could yet say with certainty. Alistair sat beside her bed that evening as she slowly regained her strength, her color returning gradually to her face, her breathing steadier than it had been in days, and he found himself thinking, with a gratitude too large for words, of how close he had come to never having this chance at all, of how narrowly the fire that had once seemed like mercy had nearly cost him everything that mattered. I read every word, he told her quietly, as she rested against her pillows, watching him with tired but clear eyes. I will keep that letter for the rest of my life, Evelina, exactly as you wrote it, and I promise you, whatever time we are given now, I will not let silence stand between us again, not ever. Evelina reached for his hand once more, her grip stronger now than it had been that first desperate night, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, though her illness would require careful attention for years to come, and though the tangled circumstances of his marriage would need honest and difficult conversations still to be had, something had finally shifted between them that neither silence nor distance, nor even time itself could easily undo again. Then let us begin honestly, she said softly. From this moment forward, whatever that honesty requires of us both. And for the first time in 4 long years, Alistair Rothmore allowed himself to believe that some mistakes, however costly, still left room for something worth building afterward, if only both people involved were finally willing to speak the truth aloud, rather than letting it burn silently away. Alistair returned to Rothmore House 10 days after that first desperate carriage ride, finding Margaret waiting for him in the same study where he had once burned so many unread letters, the fireplace now cold and empty, unused since the night everything had finally changed. She rose when he entered, studying his face carefully, reading in his exhausted but steady expression something she had perhaps already anticipated in the days since his message first reached her. "How is she?" Margaret asked, and there was genuine concern in the question, not merely polite formality. "Recovering," Alistair said, slowly, "and the physicians say her condition will require careful management for the rest of her life. But she will live, Margaret. I do not know how to properly thank you for the grace you showed in not summoning me home the moment you learned where I had gone." Margaret waved this away gently. "I have known for years, Alistair, in the quiet way one knows things without ever speaking them aloud, that some part of you remained unfinished with her. I would rather you finally resolve that, honestly, than continue carrying it silently between us for the rest of our lives together. What I could not have borne was watching you lose the chance entirely, and carrying that regret alongside everything else." They sat together for a long while that evening, speaking honestly for perhaps the first time about the true nature of their marriage, about the friendship that had genuinely grown between them despite its unconventional beginning, and about what an honest path forward might look like for both of them. Margaret spoke, with careful thoughtfulness, of her own quiet friendship with a widowed gentleman in the neighboring county, a connection she had never pursued further out of loyalty to their marriage vows, though she admitted now, in this new atmosphere of honesty, that she had often wondered what her life might have looked like, had circumstances allowed her the same freedom she now offered him. "We built something real together, whatever its beginning," Margaret said. "I do not regret our marriage, Alistair, nor do I wish to end it hastily or dishonorably, but perhaps, going forward, we might build it differently, honestly, with room for both of us to care for people outside these walls, without pretending that care does not exist." It was not a solution either of them could have imagined on their wedding day years before, nor one that fit easily into the rigid expectations of the society around them, and they both understood it would require careful, private navigation in the years ahead, protecting Margaret's reputation and the stability of the estate above all else. But it was honest, and after so many years of silence and pretense, honesty felt, to both of them, like the only foundation worth building anything further upon. Over the following months, Alistair divided his time carefully between his duties at Rothmore House and regular visits to the Ashworth estate, where Evelina's recovery continued steadily, if slowly, her strength returning gradually with careful rest and the attentive care of physicians who monitored her condition closely. Charlotte remained a constant presence throughout, her role as the keeper of secrets finally set down after so many years, replaced now by the simpler joy of watching her closest friend heal in the company of a man who had finally learned to speak his truth aloud, rather than burying it in silence. Evelina's father, initially wary of Alistair's continued presence given the complicated circumstances of his marriage, gradually softened as he witnessed the genuine devotion in the Duke's regular visits, the careful attention paid to his daughter's well-being, and the honest, uncomplicated friendship that seemed to be growing steadily between Alistair and Margaret rather than any deception or scandal. It was, he admitted privately to Charlotte one afternoon, not the future he would have chosen for his daughter, but it was, in its own unconventional way, built on more genuine honesty than many marriages he had witnessed among people who followed every proper convention. By the time winter arrived, Evelina was strong enough to walk again through her garden, bundled carefully against the cold, and it was there, among the roses she had once tended so carefully, and would tend again in the coming spring, that Alistair found her one clear December afternoon, her breath visible in the cold air, her cheeks finally carrying color again after months of illness. "You came again," she said, smiling as he approached, the same warmth in her voice that had once filled her earliest letters to him, the letters that had started everything so many years before. "I will keep coming," he said, sitting beside her on the garden bench, "for as long as you will allow it. I have learned, rather painfully, exactly what silence costs when it is chosen instead of honesty. I do not intend to make that particular mistake again, Evelina. Not with you, not with anyone." She reached for his hand, the same gesture she had made that first desperate night, though her grip now was steadier, stronger, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst and found, on the other side of it, something worth surviving for. "Then let us simply continue," she said softly. "Honestly, one letter, one conversation, one ordinary afternoon at a time. I find I no longer wish to imagine what might have been. I would rather simply live whatever time we are given, together, exactly as it comes." And in the quiet garden, with winter settling gently over the roses that would bloom again come spring, Alistair Rothmore finally understood that the years of silence, however painful, however costly, had not been the end of their story after all, only a long and difficult chapter that honesty, arriving finally and completely, had the power to heal. Spring returned to the Ashworth estate the following year, and with it came a change in Evelina's garden that felt, to everyone who witnessed it, like a quiet reflection of everything that had shifted in her life over the preceding months. The roses bloomed earlier and more fully than they had in years, tended now not only by Evelina herself, whose strength continued its slow but steady return, but also, on his regular visits, by Alistair, who had never in his life spent so much time with soil beneath his fingernails, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he genuinely enjoyed it. Their arrangement, unconventional as it remained by the standards of their society, settled gradually into something stable and sustaining for everyone involved. Margaret, true to the honesty she had first offered Alistair in that difficult conversation in his study, continued to manage the Rothmore estate with the same skill and dedication she always had, and in time, her own quiet friendship with the widowed gentleman in the neighboring county grew, carefully and privately, into something that brought her genuine happiness, separate from but never in conflict with the practical partnership she maintained with Alistair. It was not the marriage either of them had expected on their wedding day, and it required, in those early months, careful and constant attention to protect against the scandal that so easily could have destroyed all three of their reputations had the true nature of their arrangements become widely known. But between the three of them, and with Charlotte's steady discretion helping to manage the careful boundaries required, they built something that worked, however unconventionally, allowing each person involved a genuine measure of the honesty and happiness that rigid convention alone would never have permitted. Charlotte Wayland, whose loyalty and patience had carried the weight of this entire story for so many years, found her own happiness eventually too, marrying a kind and thoughtful gentleman she met through her continued closeness with the Ashworth family, though she remained, for the rest of her life, one of Evelina's dearest friends, the woman who had kept a sealed letter safe for 4 long years, waiting for the right moment neither of them could have fully predicted in advance. Evelina's health, though never fully robust again after her illness, stabilized considerably in the years that followed, managed carefully through the attentive treatment of physicians and the quiet, steady support of the people who loved her. She never regained the full vigor of her youth, and there were difficult seasons, particularly in the depths of winter, when her breathing grew labored, and worry settled once again over the household. But she lived, fully and richly, for many years beyond that desperate night when Alistair had first broken the seal on her final letter, filling those years with the garden she loved, the friendships she cherished, and the honest, steady presence of a man who had finally, after so much costly silence, learned to speak the truth without hesitation. Alistair kept that original letter for the rest of his life, the pages softened and worn from handling, tucked always in the same drawer where he had once hidden away 17 unanswered letters from a woman he had convinced himself he was protecting through silence. He read it many times over the years, not out of lingering sadness, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how much honesty mattered, and exactly how much could be lost when fear was allowed to masquerade as kindness. He often thought in later years of that evening in his study when Charlotte Wayland had called him a coward, the word that had stung so sharply at the time precisely because it had been true. He never forgot the lesson that moment had eventually taught him, and he made certain, in every relationship that mattered to him afterward, that silence never again became his answer to fear. He spoke honestly with his tenants about difficult estate matters, honestly with Margaret about the genuine nature of their unconventional partnership, and honestly, always, with Evelina, about everything from the smallest daily concerns to the deepest fears that still occasionally surfaced about her health and the uncertain years ahead. Their children, when they eventually came, 3 of them born over the following decade, grew up knowing a version of their father who valued honesty above nearly everything else, who told them plainly and directly whenever difficult news needed sharing, who never once let fear convince him that silence was the kinder choice. He told them, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of the letters he had burned, not as a tale of romance alone, but as a lesson in the real and lasting cost of choosing avoidance over honest, difficult conversation, however uncomfortable that honesty might feel in the moment. Evelina, for her part, kept her garden thriving for the rest of her life. The same roses she had once ruined through 3 failed seasons finally blooming, year after year, into something genuinely beautiful, tended now with the patient understanding that some things, given enough honest care and enough time, can grow into exactly what they were always meant to become, even after the most difficult beginnings. In the final years of her life, when her health finally began its slow, expected decline in old age rather than through the sudden crisis that had once nearly taken her decades before, Evelina would often sit in that same garden with Alistair beside her, watching the roses in the late afternoon light, and reflect quietly on how differently their story might have ended, had he never finally broken that seal, had Evelina's condition never forced the truth into the open, had either of them continued allowing fear to dictate silence instead of honesty. "We were fortunate," she told him once, during one of those quiet garden afternoons in her later years. "Fortunate that the truth found its way to us in time, even though it very nearly did not. I think of that often, Alistair. How close we came to never knowing." "We were fortunate," he agreed, taking her hand the way he had that first desperate night beside her sickbed so many years before. "But I have also come to believe that fortune alone was not enough. It took your courage in writing that final letter at all, even not knowing if it would ever be read. It took Charlotte's patience in keeping it safe for so many years, and in the end, it took my own willingness, however delayed, to finally choose honesty over fear. Fortune opened the door, Evelina, but we still had to be the ones brave enough to walk through it." She smiled at this, the same warm, knowing smile that had first drawn him to her letters so many decades before, back when rain fell against tall windows and a rescued dog slept at the foot of his bed, back before duty and fear had nearly cost them everything worth having. The story of the Duke who burned every letter she ever wrote became, in time, a quiet legend among those who knew the family well, told not as a simple romance, but as a cautionary tale about the true cost of silence, and the fragile, precious value of honesty spoken in time, before the fire takes what can never quite be recovered. Alistair Rothmore lived the remainder of his life guided by the lesson those burned letters had taught him at such painful cost, and Evelina Ashworth, having finally been heard after years of believing herself forgotten, spent her remaining years surrounded by a garden in full bloom, a devoted circle of friends and family, and a truth that had, against every fear that once threatened to keep it silent forever, finally and completely been spoken aloud.